everyone, and welcome to the Courage 365 show. I'm your host, Ashley Easter, and I am so glad that you've decided to join us today. I have a special guest that I'm going to be introducing on the show in just a few minutes. I just want to talk a little bit about the show first. This is a new thing that Courage 365 is doing. You're probably most familiar with our event, the Courage Conference, and this is just a new way that we are showing up to support survivors and advocates in our community. So before we jump into this interview, I just want to bring our attention to some of the things that are going on in our nation right now, particularly a conversation around George Floyd and all of the other men and women of color who've been killed by police brutality and other racist and white supremacist events. And I want to say that there are good police officers out there, but, this is a cultural thing that we really need to shift. There are too many of these deaths happening, and they have been for a very long time. We can no longer remain silent about this. And at Courage 365, we want to do our part to bring in voices of color. We want to do our part to raise our voices in support of people of color who are going through these very challenging times now and for so many years in the past. And I would just challenge you, if you're a white listener, a white watcher, that you begin by educating yourself about this issue and then following Black leaders and leaders of color as they are creating movements and ways that you can get involved. No more white saviorism, no more trying to fix this on our own. We really need to get behind the people of color leaders who are starting these effective movements. And I just want to say a word to our people of color listeners. We hear you, we see you, we love you, and we are learning, and we will continue to learn about ways that we can get behind and support you and your efforts. So I just wanted to mention that because this is something that's heavy on my heart, and I know heavy on the heart of many of our listeners. Racism and racist acts are a form of abuse, so it is very relevant to our conversations. So it's something that we're going to be continuing to dialogue about. This isn't something that we just talk about once and then it goes away. No, this is something that has been embedded into our country, embedded into our world, and we need to take a stand and work together to bring justice and healing. Well, next up on the show, we're going to be interviewing Cristy Horsley, and she is an amazing guest. You're going to love her so much. But right before we do that, let's go to this short commercial, and we'll see you in a few. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Courage 365 show. Again, I'm your host, Ashley Easter, and I have a wonderful guest today, Cristy Horsley, and she is such an amazing advocate for abuse survivors. She works for CASA as an advocate for children going through the court system, and I'm just going to take a quick minute to read her bio so you can get to know her a little bit more. Hey Cristy, thank you so much for being on the show. So glad to have you here. In Cristy's bio, she says, she served with CASA, which stands for Court Appointed Special Advocate for Children. She served with them for about a year and a half as a volunteer, and then in 2014, she came on staff with them. So she's been doing this work since several years ago. She's been doing this for quite a while. And at CASA, she got introduced to more and more people who have this social justice advocacy mission, and she's learned from them, and she's picked up so many tools and an understanding of trauma. And today we're going to be talking to her about the transformational power of connection. And I know you're going to love hearing from her so much. Thank you so much for being here, Cristy. It's really an honor.
Yeah, no, believe me, the honor is mine. Like you
Uh,
said, the Courage Conference and um, even Twitter, the tool of Twitter has really introduced me to so many amazing advocate voices. And I'm
mm.
just honored to be allowed to hang along the fringes, with all the cool kids.
Well, you have such an important voice, and the work I do as an advocate. A lot of times, mine is the kind of talking to press or those types of things, but it's really the people who are on the ground every day that are impacting lives directly on a consistent basis. A lot of my advocacy work is there's some personal touch to it, but not to the degree of what you're doing, and it's so amazing your investment into these children's lives. And I read your bio, I talked a little bit, and maybe we could just talk about how we met. I was thinking the other day that we met through the Courage Conference, but you corrected me, and was it Boz Chavijan who introduced us?
Yes, yeah. Boz
Uh,
is the OG.
he really is, yeah. So shout out to Boz Chavijan. Thanks
Yep.
for he's made a lot of great connections for me, and
Yeah.
you're obviously a really awesome connection. Um, But tell me about your work with CASA. What exactly does CASA stand for? What do they do? And for people who aren't familiar with that term, what is it? And also, like, is it everywhere in the country? Is it, just in Virginia or all those things? Tell us.
Yeah, good question. So CASA stands for Court Appointed Special Advocate, and it was started, it's a volunteer program, actually. I'm a staff member, but CASA is staffed primarily through volunteers. It's
Mm,
volunteers that plug into cases of child abuse and neglect to really soak up additional information, to soak up everything there is to know about that child and give it back to the judge so that they can make high quality decisions in
mm,
foster neglect. Like one of our judges says all the time, a cake is only as good as the ingredients you put in. Well,
mm.
in B&D court in foster care cases, the decisions that you get are only going to be as good as the information you put in. And
Right,
for high stakes cases involving abuse, neglect, potentially termination of parental rights, returning the child to the home of a former abuser. These are high stakes decisions,
right.
and on making the decision, and that is the person that has the least information about that child in that situation, if you stop to think about it. So, the CASA
Mm,
advocate, someone from outside the system, that they come in and get to know the child and their world deeply and report that back to the judge. So I started out as a CASA volunteer myself. I did that for about 18 months before I came on staff. And as you pointed out, it feels like I've been on staff for about a billion years now, and I don't know how that happened.
so
Didn't really
amazing.
belong like that.
Wow. Well, thank you for putting in that dedication and effort. And I know that there are so many children who are experiencing abuse and neglect, so many children who have, experienced the foster care system. And I'm just so glad that they have a supportive advocate like you who's able to really get to know them and do your very best to help the courts make the safest decisions for these little children's lives. And what are the age ranges that you've worked with?
Yeah, so we advocate for children age 0 to 21.
Mm,
Potentially, most of our kids opt out by around the age of 18. But yeah, we have the very young all the way up to teens. And actually, something that you said, yes. So a lot of the work that I do is in the trenches and directly supervising the volunteers that plug into those
mm,
cases, meeting families at court hearings, um, different things like that. But also, as I have been along in the trenches and seen patterns play out, we get to meet children that have experienced abuse and neglect, but I also get to see it a generation later in the
Mm,
parents.
yeah.
So many of our experienced abuse or neglect themselves. Many of them were in the foster care system, aged out of foster care. Also, a lot of our volunteers who come to serve as CASA volunteers, they themselves had trauma or abuse in their background and
Right.
are trying to put that to good use. So I will say part of what I feel like my role or my personal mission with CASA is to explain, to sort of translate the impact that trauma causes. So sometimes that translating looks like at a school meeting as we're all
Mm,
sitting around, and maybe the school is focused on Johnny's bad behaviors and being
right.
suspended 10,000 times. And sometimes we have to bring it back to, well, that's a pretty natural outcome based on what's been experienced.
Right.
And also doing that same thing on our social media pages and also doing it in the policy world too.
Mm,
That's an exciting aspect on the state level in the past couple of years, being able to participate in advocacy to, improve our decision making around foster care and different things like that.
absolutely. That is, yeah, such important work. And thank you for explaining that. And is CASA something that is just, in Virginia, or is it something that spans other states?
Right. No, I'm glad you asked that because I did forget to mention that. No, CASA exists nationwide.
Wow.
Within each state, it exists in all 50 states, but it really, you have to check with your specific locality. For Virginia, if you Google CASA program Virginia, you can go to the interactive map on the Virginia CASA website
Hmm.
and pick out what program is closest to you. But yeah, there's a national CASA website too. You can just Google it. When I worked in
That's
the call center at Liberty University online, I would have students call and apply all the time that were CASA volunteers. So, yeah.
very good. Yeah, that's amazing. So, anybody, listen closely to this talk because it may spark in you a desire to volunteer, and we'll give you more information about that at the end. But, Cristy, I would love to kind of transition into really the focus of our chat today. So, when you and I connected before, you mentioned the transformational power of connection, and that is, uh, I number one, I love the wording of that, and I would just love for you to share what do you mean by the transformational power of connection, and then maybe are there any specific stories you could share about how you've seen connection change the life of a child?
Yeah. Yeah. So when we talk about the concept of connection, it comes back to the idea of when there has been abuse that has occurred in relationships, interpersonal abuse.
Right.
The way that you heal from that is by experiencing the opposite, by experiencing
Mm,
safety and caring connection. Um, you can put up walls, you can put up distance, you can pursue other methods of healing, yoga, art therapy, all kinds of things. But true embodied living won't return completely until you're able to experience that safe connection.
right.
So what that looks like for some of my kiddos or, individuals in cases. So for a parent, this might mean they're not able to really progress on their substance abuse treatment until they form a trusting relationship with a
Mm,
provider. Or
right.
sometimes it's with the CASA volunteer that, you know, firmly communicates to them, hey, I am in your corner. I believe that you can do this, and I am rooting for you to be successful. Sometimes it is a teacher that really envisions that child's future in a way that sometimes when you're in the middle of trauma or abuse or just despair, sometimes hope is a really heavy thing to hold on to.
Right.
And we just really can't sustain it for ourselves. So sometimes connection, the favor that they do for us is being our hope holder
Ah,
temporarily.
that's
Um,
beautiful.
I,
Hope holder.
Yes, and in my mind, I've come to call that concept, longitudinal optimism.
Mm,
Um, Envisioning a future, saying that this version, this traumatized version, this has maybe this has changed and shaped who you are, but we don't want you to stay here in this place of
right.
despair or harm. I believe in everything that you are capable of being, and I will continue to firmly believe that, and walk with you on this journey. Because again, even sometimes envisioning all the work that it's going to take to get to that place is completely overwhelming. So
Mm,
sometimes we have to hold on to that vision, firmly believe in it, and help the person think about just very small bite-sized steps that come next.
right.
I think the story that you and I had talked about connection was, there is a teacher who's pretty well known, does a lot of trauma informed teaching in Virginia. Her name is Dr. Allison Sampson Jackson. And in
Mm,
her youth, she also experienced trauma and had a lot of subsequent hospitalizations as a result of it. She was on a lot of different psychiatric meds,
mm,
and eventually, after repeated hospital admissions, this one particular nurse kind of jokingly asked her, "Are you coming in here to see me?" And she said,
mm,
"Yeah, yeah, I
mm.
am." So
Wow.
as a result of that, he made a plan with her to meet her outside of the hospital and start,
Mm,
seeing her regularly. And so, that allowed her to progress. And I
wow.
will also say too, I have seen kids who have been placed with foster families, and, our kids are challenging. They've all experienced
Sure.
abuse and neglect. So many of them are kind of in that trauma spiral, if you will.
Mhm.
So a lot of our kids do have mental health tools
Right.
in the toolkit that help you with meds, counseling. So some of our kids will be placed with foster parents who great foster parents taking care of them, giving as much as they can. But then when I have seen some of those kids transition back to family,
Right.
um, some of those mental health issues smooth out when the underlying relational needs are
Right.
met. When you are deeply known and deeply loved,
Mm.
that is just, it's a balm to the spirit.
Mm. Wow.
And I would
That's
argue that so
that's
many
really
of
deep.
the things that we articulate as mental health issues, I would argue that a lot of it is underlying what we would call attachment issues.
Mm,
Um,
yes.
and that's a term that we use a lot in my world, and that really relates to the patterns of relationships, how we form relationships, and it
Mm.
all goes back to how we were nurtured as kids. Psychology Today actually has a free online attachment quiz that you can take to kind of see maybe what your relationship or attachment style is as an adult.
That's great. Yeah, I've looked into attachment styles as well, and it's I think it's powerful for everybody. And I believe there's the secure attachment style, the avoidant attachment style, the anxious attachment style, and the fearful attachment style, which is like avoidant and anxious together. And um, I think for anybody watching, if you want to go and take a test like that, just Google it. I think you said it's in Psychology Today. It can be very helpful in understanding yourself. And my understanding is that we gain our attachment style when we're just a few days old based on our environment and the people around us. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say so. And so absolutely, attachment styles and patterns become imprinted absolutely in infancy, based on, if I cry, do mom or dad come?
Right.
We've had infants, and even remember when ICE was separating children from families, there were reports of that it was silent inside the detention centers.
Mm,
Children had learned that nobody would come when they cried.
mm,
So, absolutely, it forms in infancy. And then it just keeps going from there. But I also, it's really interesting to think about too. Trauma can impact us in utero as well.
mm.
So mom's amount of stress or regulation. So the baby's brain forms around the heartbeat of the mother. So just imagine if you have a mom in a domestic violence situation
Okay.
that is regular spikes of adrenaline and cortisol to her
Yeah.
body as she is dealing with fear and different things too.
Hmm.
Um, so, you know, there's so much attachment and nurturing and trauma going on in utero as well. So
Wow.
those are all things to think about as well. Because I've had children that were removed from the parents just at the hospital. They never spent a day at home with mom or dad in their life.
Hmm.
And then whenever they would have visitation supervised at social services, the child just had a very strong negative reaction to the parents,
Right.
could not tolerate held or being in the same room. So absolutely the
Hmm.
bonding work or lack is going on well before birth.
That I think that's really key for people to understand. And if you're watching, maybe this is something to take note of. Maybe write down and do some more research on. But a lot of times when we think about trauma, we think about big life events, and it can definitely be that. But a lot of times, trauma is things that we don't necessarily think of as catastrophic at the time. So it could be, like Cristy said, a mother experiencing abuse while the baby is still in her belly. It could be from a first couple of days or weeks as the child's developing, things that you would think, oh, that child will never remember this. Like, they're learning these coping mechanisms to survive in life, and that's either avoidant or anxious or fearful or hopefully secure. And then there's epigenetics. And Cristy, could you maybe talk about that a little bit? Because that's another factor in people, you know, feeling trauma and then also having their actions show that they are experiencing or have experienced trauma.
Absolutely. Yeah. So with epigenetics, that's also what we would call intergenerational or historical trauma. So scientists have done a range of studies on, for example, descendants of Union prisoners of war, um, descendants of um, in the lab, one thing they studied was rats who were shocked at the scent of cherry blossoms. And what they found is that even later generations that never received shocks, they still showed discomfort or fear at the scent of cherry blossoms.
Mm,
Um, just because their parents had that experience. So
right.
the thought is that trauma experiences, change our DNA, so that we even pass it on, so that generations maybe will have a more favorable experience in that same stressful environment. So that's kind of the thought with that.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Mm,
And also, I just want to point out as well, because I feel like Dr. Nadine Burke Harris does a good job of explaining this. I didn't really understand it at first. So, the audience might be familiar with the concept of ACEs, adverse childhood events, or
yeah.
basically trauma experienced in childhood. And so, the concept with ACEs is that the more of them that you've had, then the worse the impact on your physical health is.
Mm,
That includes like heart disease. It increases your rate of possibility of alcoholism, drug abuse,
mm,
um, cancer, so many different things. And I, for a long time, just thought it contributed to, oh, of course, people are self medicating because of the trauma. But
right.
Dr. Burke Harris out that it's things going on in your endocrine system that
Hmm.
then create those behavioral choices. So again, think about what your body is experiencing after you have a car accident. Your
Mm,
heart is pumping. Your body's not super focused on digestion, for example, or it'd be really hard to take like a really complex quiz after that. So your body just focuses on the key life sustaining things, and
right.
you've got surges of cortisol and adrenaline. So just think about a child that is living in an environment where they are chronically experiencing that.
Mm,
That impacts oh, what is the word I'm looking for? Like anti-inflammatory
Yeah.
disease in your body,
Yep.
like rheumatoid arthritis or
Yeah.
asthma
Yeah.
or
And I have
different.
ulcerative colitis, and it's inflammatory bowel disease. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. So all those things can be linked to early trauma.
Right. And so, just to kind of solidify this portion of the conversation, so we've talked about trauma and we've talked about how that really can cause actions and behaviors from children and adults too. That they wouldn't normally act and behave that way, but because of the trauma, that's their body is putting them in this position where they're flooded with all these hormones, chemicals, and just all that they're carrying. So how can connection come in and make a difference? Like, can somebody change from an avoidant or a fearful or anxious attachment style? Can connection help facilitate them, gaining a more stable life where those things aren't quite as overwhelming for them?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, when a child can experience or an adult can experience safety in a relationship, for one thing, that can actually, impact the body's ability to regulate. And really and truly, if you think about it, if a child has never had regulation or rhythm or predictability in their environment, even in the womb potentially,
Mm,
then regulation is going to have to come from outside. They can't learn it themselves. It can't come out of nowhere.
right.
So it's going to be in a relationship from a safe, stable, caring adult that a child is going to get those things.
Mm,
Um, and then also, you know, in terms of that connection, um, sometimes in my world, again, we see people wanting to make parents or children earn connection.
mm,
So, for example, sometimes I've seen where siblings who are placed in separate foster homes,
yeah.
for various reasons, sometimes instead of guaranteeing regular contact, they'll say, oh, well, if you finish all your homework and you're very good, then you'll get to talk to her next week, but you have to earn it. Uh,
Right.
yeah, or sometimes we even try and make people fix their behavior to earn the connection or earn
Hmm.
treatment they need to fix the behavior. So again, in my work, a lot of times that looks like trying to make the parent test clean before they can visit with the child,
Mm,
or trying to make a mom who's experienced domestic violence show up regularly to appointments,
right.
or be available to parent while her child, while she simply does not have that capacity in the moment. So again, sometimes that connection has to happen first, and sometimes, you know, the person who is the most regulated has to be the one to really reach out in that relationship.
Mm,
I think that's something to really think about too. I don't think that that's going to be a new concept for your audience because, especially for trauma survivors, I think that they get that. Like when I'm depressed, when I'm traumatized, I don't necessarily have the strength to be reaching out. So we're
right.
really dependent on others to do that. So I think as we kind of graduate to where we have the emotional or the mental capacity to do that, then we've got to be assertive about reaching out. Um,
Mm. And kind of transitioning from that, like for people who are maybe they were survivors and still identify as survivors but have kind of made that transition into an advocate or a support system for somebody else. um, if you could name like three types of three tips that they could learn regarding how they can be assertive about connection with others, what would you say would be like the top three tips you would give an advocate for connecting with those that they're serving?
yeah, yeah. So I would say remembering the term unconditional positive regard for one thing. So again, when we are, especially at the very beginning of a relationship, with someone who is traumatized and who has experienced wounding in relationship, you have to anticipate and just work off the assumption that they're going to be suspicious. They may not really give good contact back, good
Mhm.
return at first. So you have to not be phased at first. You just have to be consistent about
Mhm.
reaching out and be very positive when you see them and in the contacts you make, and don't make your contact conditional upon them
Performing.
accepting you.
Yeah.
Right. And, you know, again, a very concrete way that I see this in cases is a lot of times when we have a child that is joining a family that potentially might be their adoptive family,
Mhm.
you know, a lot of times the family may sort of wait for a cue from the child to show that they like them, or yes, I want this to be my family, when really the responsibility is up to the parent
Yeah.
to demonstrate, I want you, you belong here. Again, we have to give that to the traumatized person. We
Mm.
have to go out and be the seekers. So again, we don't necessarily want to be invasive with
Mhm.
contact, but you know, in my line of work, that looks like, hey, if mom isn't answering calls, then maybe I'll try a text. Maybe I'll try swinging by the house and knocking on the door one day.
Mhm.
For my child in the residential treatment center that is declining to take my calls, then I'm probably going to need to send a card so they know that I'm still thinking about them and caring about
Mm.
them.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really, really important. And it makes me think about very traditional Western parenting styles with punishment. And so a lot of times what we see is there's either a spanking, which is not fostering connection, or there is social isolation in the form of a timeout. And what I'm kind of hearing from you is whether a child is acting out because of trauma they've experienced or whether it's just their age and they're just trying to figure out life, they're a new human here on this earth. Um, it seems like the way to get the results that we all want, which is, you know, a child who's well adjusted, a child who is safe and happy, and, you know, all those things, has a good relationship with a parent, that connection is going to be really key when a child is misbehaving, whether that is for trauma or not. And I think parents a lot of times don't always know the trauma that children are carrying because, again, it could have been something that was in utero or what is passed on through generations. Or maybe it was, you know, an act they experienced in this lifetime that the parent's just not aware of. And I really think this is solid advice for advocates in working with adult or children survivors. But also just for parents in general, realizing if I really want to be most effective, fostering positive connection over the long term is really going to be, um, you know, it's kind of the long game. You know, it's a lot more convenient to be able to be like, just go, you know, distance yourself or, you know, spanking or something, but seems most effective from a scientific standpoint, from a trauma standpoint, that the connection piece is really gonna get the desired results we all have. Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Do you have any other tips for advocates?
Yeah, I would say maybe two things. What you mentioned made me think about, I think that is one of the most important things. Handling conflict and what I would call repair work is
Mm,
probably one of the most important things that we can do when we're dealing with those who've experienced abuse or trauma. So, especially for my kiddos who've experienced abuse or neglect, they anticipate, they're very familiar with relational breakage,
right.
right? With, oh my gosh, you ruined
Yeah.
everything. Now you're the outcast, or this is a
Mhm.
disaster, or being screamed at, or some, or worse. So I think one of the most important gifts that we can give is modeling good repair strategies, because conflict is going to happen. It's a part of human life. And
Mhm.
if we can indicate that, hey, that's a normal thing, that's okay, let's model how to disagree well and how to work through that. But also, if, wrong has occurred or we've had a fight, hey, how can I model, you know, bringing you back to the relationship? And I want to be clear here. I'm not talking about relationship with the abusers here.
Right,
I'm
right,
talking about, for a child who, I don't know, threw an eraser at his sibling.
right.
I'm going to correct that and let him know, hey, that's not safe. We can't do that. But also be very clear and very quick about bringing him back in, being cheerful with him and bringing him back into the next activity to clearly communicate, hey, you're not an outcast forever. We're good. So I
Right.
think that's really important. And
Wow.
that's a big reason why, for example, for our kids especially, it's not effective anyway for anyone, but suspensions and expulsions are
Right. Yep. Yep.
for our kids. That just furthers that isolation and exclusion narrative that our kids already have running in their heads.
Right.
And the last thing I would say for advocates, and this may sound like the opposite, but I would say you need to know your demographic. You need to know who is yours to carry and who is not. And then you need to set your boundaries.
Yeah.
Because, I feel like a lot of people who love helping, we love helping, right? So we want to help or fix the whole world. It's not possible. And also, it's not necessarily healthy.
Yep.
So we need to know that there are people with diverse giftings out there. We don't have to do it all ourselves. And then we need to know who is the demographic that is my responsibility, that I am supposed to be helping or treating, and then kind of focus on them. And then maybe amplify other voices that are coming in to do the work in other fields that we also care about. Help where we can, but not focus our direct energy on that.
Right, because when we're so spread out and spread thin, we're really not able to impact, as greatly if, we're only able to get an inch deep, and I tell my coaching clients all the time who struggle with that, need to please and that feeling of just like, I want to help so many people, I tell them it is statistically impossible for you to help everyone. So just come to grips with the fact that you can't help everyone. And then, based on your gifting, based on your calling, based on what your intuition is telling you, find that group of people who you can serve. So your suggestion is just so, so helpful. And, having those boundaries set. And even one thing that I tell advocates as well is you're not always qualified. So even if you want to help people in these other groups, like you said, lifting up voices of people who are qualified for that. So it's not even just that you'll get stretched thin, but don't try to take the place of a therapist if you're not a therapist. Don't try to take the place of law enforcement if you're not law enforcement. Don't try to take the place of other people doing work here. But find what your role is. Find what you are good at and how you can serve in a really particular way. And that can be super, super impactful. And I think when we come together as advocates, again, that connection piece, we have a greater impact in the world. And so thank you so much for bringing that all up. And it makes me wonder, like with these very strained times, with these very traumatic times for a lot of people, what do you think about everybody being so socially distant and disconnected in a lot of ways during COVID-19? How is that impacting survivors? How is that impacting people in general when we know connection is so valuable and important?
Right. Yeah. So the one way that I have seen it in my own life is I'm very actively engaged on social media. I think that there's a lot of thought formation and discipleship, if you will, that occurs online. So I don't think that that's a space that can or should be abandoned. However, what I have found, the formula is, if I'm getting too despairing over what I'm seeing on social media, the way that I fix that is to turn down the virtual and turn up the in person. And
Mm,
honestly, that's the way I recharge in general, like in my work, the way that I get recharged is by focusing on very individual, specific, teeny tiny successes
Mm,
and interactions. But that has not been possible for me because I live alone. So that has been really difficult.
right.
A lot of my engagement with the outside world is happening virtually.
Mm,
So that's been challenging, and I would suspect that that's a similar challenge faced by a lot of survivors. Um, and we know that stressors are increasing. And it was something that I read recently that talked about how having to wear a mask, that not even necessarily the touching of the face, but just being out of control,
yeah.
having a rule imposed,
Yeah.
can be very triggering for survivors.
Mm,
And it sounds like that is being affirmed. So I would suppose that looking for small ways where you can take back control is helpful, or seek regulation or routine. I know for myself, I love to do lists and productivity in my job. That's a really hard thing to come by. Things are not tidy.
right.
You don't really get nice little check off lists at the end of the day. So, what has just been a thrill for me is taking out the trash twice a week. Like, that's a very concrete, oh, this is something specific that got done. It's a marker of
Right.
time. Like washing dishes. And I normally hate housework, but very small things, I think, that you can look to that will bring you, a sense of control over your
Right.
environment.
Mm,
And that's been helpful for me. Again, just investing in my environment in my house to try and make
mm,
it a place where I want to be and that will be soothing to my senses.
right. Yeah. No, that's really good. I think routine is really important because um, I did an online course a couple weeks ago. Maybe it was over a month ago now, goodness, but it was one of those things where it was such a lifesaver because there was coursework that needed to be turned in at the end of the week, and it just helped me again mark time and not get lost and what day is it and all these types of things. So yeah, that's a super helpful tip. And do you have any insight on connection with the traumatic things that are going on in the world and have been for so many years, regarding George Floyd and the other men and women who have been killed? How do you perceive connection being a way forward? Because it seems like we're getting more and more divided as a country. We always have been, so maybe it's just the spotlight's being turned on. Um, but do you believe that connection could be a part of this healing? And if so, what are your dreams for connection around the racial injustices we're seeing?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So I feel like in my own journey, connection has definitely been a key part, for me to grow in awareness. And please, I'm not saying that I'm there,
Sure, we're
but
all working.
also
Yeah.
just a couple hours ago, we had the announcement by Jerry Falwell Jr. that he apologized for the tweet, regarding the mask. And I watched a live interview that he did with a local news person, Andre Whitehead, and he was talking about how it was from hearing through Black alumni, faculty, students, pastors, and he mentioned a couple specific people that sat down and talked with him, that cued him on, hey, these are a couple concrete things right now. So, time will tell how
Mhm.
deeply felt his apology is. But I think if he continues to grow from here, and if there is to be institutional change at Liberty, it's going to be relationship and these personal relationships that really save the day.
Right.
Um, and I certainly don't want to sound like I'm putting the responsibility on, you know, oppressed or traumatized
Right. Right.
individuals the ones to save or educate us. But I will also say, for me, it was a specific turning point, as I, through my work, have built relationships with
Mm.
more individuals of color because I am an LCA grad. That's the high school that was associated with Liberty University, and it was a private school. There were very few students of color, so my world did not have a lot of relationships
Right.
with individuals of color. And as I've continued on through my career and increase the number of those relationships, just the influence from the social media of those people, seeing that white individuals or culture wasn't necessarily centered in their timeline and being introduced to more resources, that was a teaching tool for
Mm.
me. And again, I think that's a huge part that social media has played, is allowing more stories to come to light. We
Yeah.
didn't only have to rely on traditional access points
Yeah.
for those stories to get out. So I think that has been huge. It's really democratized the sharing of information and images.
Mm.
As protests have been occurring, so many images and
Yeah.
videos are coming out, and I think that's
Right.
been huge. So I
Absolutely.
really do think relationship is the place. And
Mm.
I will point out too, I think when it comes to racism, I feel like at its core somewhere, of course, it's a love for power, but also I think somehow it's connected to fear, and fear of loss of identity,
Mm.
loss of position. But I will say, as more education occurs and racial bridge building occurs, I've been seeing relationships being deepened. Like, there are
Mm.
people in my own life, as they are wrestling with some of this information, and making progress. The relationships are deepening, they're becoming sweeter rather than relationships or connection going away.
Right.
And again, that's really a good gift that we can press forward to.
Mm.
Um,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
and
Thank you.
it's not uncommon. Again, just in work that I've seen, it's not uncommon in some of my cases in a sibling group for there to be one specific sibling that is singled out for abuse in the family.
Right.
And again, I think that something parallels our national story at this point.
Yeah.
And when we are fixing that, safety has to be the first priority, to get that child to safety.
Right.
But then also we have to do some concentrated work on talking about, hey, this abuse was normalized and everybody in the family kind of participated and
Right.
thought this was okay to pick on this person. That's not okay. And this is how we're going to interact moving forward.
Mm.
Have to really do some therapeutic work fixing those dynamics and those methods of engagement. And I think
Right.
the same is true for us as well at a national level.
Mm. That makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah. So some of my takeaways from what you just said is, you know, white people in particular, if you have a white friend who's doing damage, who's doing something that's unhealthy, unsafe, that is hurting other people, whether that is conscious or unconscious. Um, in the case of Jerry Falwell, I don't know his heart. I'm very skeptical of him for many reasons. But, in those situations, like Cristy was saying, change can happen when people talk to that person. And, I don't know who all spoke to him. And, if it was mainly white people or people of color. But, white people, when those things happen, we really need to put that burden on ourselves to call out our white brother or sister and be like, hey, that's wrong, because people of color are going through this trauma every day, and that's just an additional weight that they have to carry if we expect them to always have to initiate that education. And so, what Thomas Edward talked about in our previous show, when I was, asking him about his thoughts about these issues, he said one of the best things white people can do is get educated. And that doesn't mean hounding your friends of color, your black friends with questions. There is education available, and a lot of it honestly for free. But, I do recommend paying black people and people of color. But I'm going to be taking a course, the University of Illinois I think it starts tomorrow actually, on African American history in the US. And that's not going to fix everything. That doesn't mean after I take this course, I'm done with my work and that my privilege is gone, or any of those things. But actively reading books written by people of color, actively researching the racial trauma of our nation, of our world, taking initiative in those areas. And yeah, relationships are so important. Getting to know people who are different from you, not for the sake of, oh, now I have a black friend or a person of color friend, like that should never be the reason. But when we see each other as human, we're able to have empathy and more easily see what we're doing that's wrong, whether it's intentional or not intentional, because of that connection, and how we can see, okay, oh, I didn't realize I was doing this, but I see my friends of color are being impacted by statements like this, or policies, or all those things. So I do think that having connection is valuable, and that it's going to be, like you said, Cristy, the connection that eventually makes that change. Policies are important, and we should get behind those things, but we really got to get to the hearts of people, change people's hearts, turn on their empathy, turn on their connectedness to other people, and shine a light on our own privilege. So thank you so much, Cristy, and we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back in a few minutes.
So there's choices that you have the opportunity to make. You can either stay with your abuser or you can leave. And make no mistake about it, it's going to be hard either way you go. But I can tell you one thing for sure. If you do decide to make that courageous decision to go, there's hope. So much hope.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Courage 365, and we're here with Cristy Horsley, and we've just had a great conversation about the transformational power of connection. And Cristy, I'd just like to ask you just two more quick questions before we go. So one is, out of all the advice that you've gotten, as an advocate working in this field, working with people who've experienced trauma, with children who've experienced trauma, what has been the best piece of advice that you've received that's really impacted your life?
Yeah. I was thinking about this, and honestly, I don't know if it's a piece of advice so much as it is an aphorism, but I love the saying, the wise man loves a bit of foolishness. Basically, what that means is don't forget to laugh along the way. Also, life is ridiculous and plays its own jokes on us from time to time. You can't really work with people unless you maintain a sense of humor, and a sense of irony, appreciation for irony, let's say.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think laughter and humor really is what keeps me going. So I, I totally get what you're saying there, because sometimes days can feel dark and heavy, but we've gotta come back to joy, and laughter, and not taking ourselves too seriously. That's a great way. So, how can people get connected with CASA? How can they learn about volunteering? Do you have social media people can follow? All those things. People are going to want to talk to you after this.
Absolutely. So our website is cvcasa.org. That's C like Central and then V Virginia dot cvcasa.org. And then basically our Facebook is similar. Just search for CASA of Central Virginia, and our Twitter and Instagram as well. You can find me on Twitter at Eat, Read, Provoke. I like to interact with folks. And again, that's where I've really done a lot of listening to advocate voices, and I really appreciate those relationships and interactions.
Yes, thank you so much for that. People, go on and give Cristy and CASA a follow, and we will make sure to include those links for you all. And yeah, I'm so grateful to have had you on the show. Thank you so much, Cristy, for being here. And yeah, I'd also invite everyone to pop on over to the Courage 365 social media accounts and give us the follow right now. We are streaming live every Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern. And so far, it's just been streaming live to Facebook. But once we get our technology in order, it's going to be streaming live to Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So you'll be able to access it all those different ways. And I'd encourage you to hop on over to the courage365.org website. And just for coming to the website, there's a free gift that we have for you just for being there. And that book is 5 Keys to Living a Life of Courage. And that goes over 5 steps to really living that courageous life that you deserve. And if you check out our website, we have a resource page. You can click the tab at the top that says Need Help, and right there's a short little video, and then below that we have tons and tons of links to different services and different ways that you can get connected. There's hotlines. And so if you or somebody's experiencing abuse, of course, if there's imminent danger, call the police. But if you're looking for resources outside of that, please hop over to Courage 365 and click the Need Help button. And we're going to be consistently uploading replays of these episodes of the Courage 365 show, and you'll be able to find those on the website too. Be on the lookout for trainings. And if you download that free ebook, you are also going to have access to an email reminder that's going to let you know about our shows coming up, our guests coming up, as well as the great trainings that we're going to be offering in the near future. So everyone, thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Cristy, for being here today. We love you all and have a good night.